confederal model for Syria, if I could now lay out a couple of these ideas. The basic notion in the common vernacular might be to think about what's a Bosnia model? How do we recognize that Humpty Dumpty is not going to be easily stitched back together, that Syria is largely, certainly not entirely, but largely segregated along sectarian lines, and maybe it makes the most sense to try to help create autonomous zones of governance and also work within these autonomous zones to build up security forces that can act as opposition to ISIL and Assad. This then becomes not only a political vision for the country's future, but a roadmap for how do we work more closely with the Syrian opposition. And the basic idea that I would have here, in addition to saying that a strong unitary government strikes me as unrealistic, is that I think a confederal model allows us to potentially create some bridges or at least deconflict our differences with Turkey as well as Russia. So in this vision of a future Syria, which is not yet ripe for negotiation, but I would hope would get there in coming years, the idea would be to have an Alawite sector in the country's northwest, and maybe Assad could wind up there as sort of a compromise. He wouldn't have to step down from all positions of public life, but he would only have any authority over his own fellow Alawites. And Russians could be part of a peacekeeping force that would ultimately help this deal. This is the kind of vision that I would at least hope would mitigate some of the differences we have now with our friends the Turks, who are nervous about any collaboration with Kurdish forces because they see that potentially as a way to help the PKK in their own country and also maybe even promote the idea of Kurdish independence. If we're very clear about the confederal model being as far as this would go, it allows us to potentially, at least hypothetically, work with the Kurds without eliciting this fear that we're really sort of pursuing or encouraging Kurdish independence in disguise. So at a political level, it hypothetically at least allows us to, I think, come up with a strategy that Russia and Turkey in theory would object to less than the current approach. Militarily, what this allows us to do is to get on the ground in a few places. And get on the ground with a lot more than the 50 special forces that President Obama has recently authorized. I'm envisioning up to several hundred or even maybe a couple thousand Americans, also British, French, Turkish, Saudi, Jordanian special forces, acting primarily as trainers whenever it's become safe enough to get on the ground and do so. And essentially, this is an ink spot strategy for building up more military capability in the opposition by working with them where they live, instead of expecting them to come out of the country where it's so hard for them to get, where they're leaving their communities defenseless along the way, where I don't think they have the time or feel they have the time to be able to just leave the battlefield for a year and then maybe come back later. And so the notion here would be get on the ground, help build up these autonomous zones, and then further on down the path, maybe in a year or two, then the peace talks to stitch this together in a formal way would become possible. And it would necessitate at that point deployment of an international peacekeeping force.